My parents attempted to humiliate me at a family event for not financially supporting them and my spoiled brother. Weddings are supposed to be joyous occasions, full of laughter and celebration. But as I drove to my cousin Mia's wedding, all I felt was dread. I hadn't seen my parents or my younger brother Ethan in months. Our last interaction had ended in a shouting match, with them accusing me of being selfish for refusing to help them financially. To say my relationship with my family was strained would be an understatement. While Ethan lived at home in comfort, coddled and free from responsibility, I had fought tooth and nail to get where I was. My parents had made it clear I was on my own the moment I turned 18. College? You figure it out, my mom had said with a shrug, and my dad had laughed when I asked for support. Meanwhile, they poured everything into Ethan, paying his tuition, buying him a car, and excusing every bad decision he made. Now, with their finances in ruins, they expected me to swoop in and fix everything. Ethan's entitlement was bad enough, but my parents' manipulative tactics were worse. They framed my refusal to help as a moral failing, conveniently forgetting the years I spent working multiple jobs to put myself through school. The irony was that their financial woes were a direct result of their favoritism. They had bled themselves dry enabling Ethan's lifestyle, and now they wanted me to clean up the mess. I arrived at the venue early, hoping to slip in unnoticed. The ceremony was being held at a beautiful countryside estate, with rows of white chairs arranged in neat lines under a canopy of trees. Guests were milling around, sipping champagne and greeting each other warmly. For a moment, I allowed myself to relax, thinking maybe I could get through the day without drama. That hope evaporated the moment I saw my dad weaving through the crowd toward me, his expression all too familiar. He greeted me with a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Lily," he said, his voice falsely cheerful. "Your mother and I were hoping to have a word with you later. Maybe during the reception." I felt my stomach sink. I knew that tone. It was the same one he used when he was about to lay on the guilt. "What about?" I asked warily, already bracing myself. "Oh, nothing too serious," he replied, waving a hand dismissively. "Just family matters. You know how it is." His smile sharpened, and I could feel the weight of whatever scheme he was planning pressing down on me. The ceremony itself was lovely, and for a while, I managed to push the tension to the back of my mind. Mia looked radiant as she walked down the aisle, her husband-to-be beaming at her like she was the only person in the world. Watching them exchange vows, I felt a pang of envy. I couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to have that kind of unconditional support, something I had never experienced with my own family. But the reprieve was short-lived. As soon as the reception began, my parents zeroed in on me like sharks scenting blood. I was chatting with a distant relative when my mom appeared at my side, her face a mask of forced warmth. "Lily," she said sweetly, looping her arm through mine, "we need to talk." "Now?" I glanced around, looking for an escape route, but there was none. Reluctantly, I let her guide me to a quiet corner where my dad was already waiting. His expression was stern, the faux friendliness from earlier gone. "We've been patient," he began, his voice low and firm. "But it's time you stepped up and started helping this family. Ethan and your mother and I—" "Stop right there," I interrupted, already feeling the familiar anger bubbling up. "If this is about money, the answer is no. I'm not responsible for fixing your mistakes." My dad's eyes narrowed. "Don't you dare take that tone with me," he hissed. "After everything we've done for you, you owe us." I laughed bitterly. "Everything you've done for me? Like leaving me to figure out college on my own while you handed Ethan everything he ever wanted? You must be joking." Their faces hardened, and I knew I'd crossed a line. But I didn't care. If they wanted to start something at Mia's wedding, so be it. I wasn't going to back down. The reception was magical at first. Strings of lights hung in the trees, casting a soft glow over the garden, while a live quartet played gentle music in the background. Tables were draped with crisp white linens, each adorned with flickering candles and lush floral arrangements. For a moment, I allowed myself to enjoy the evening, sipping champagne and chatting with distant cousins who didn't know the drama brewing beneath the surface. But, like clockwork, my parents were waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It happened during dinner, just as the speeches were winding down. I was seated at a round table with several relatives, laughing at a story Mia's maid of honor had told, when my mom's overly cheerful voice cut through the chatter. "Isn't it wonderful that Lily just got promoted?" she said loudly, her tone dripping with exaggerated pride. Heads turned toward us, and I felt the weight of curious stares settling on me. Before I could respond, she continued, "She's doing so well for herself. We're so proud." She turned to me, her smile sharp and predatory. "You know, it's a shame that success hasn't translated into helping your family, though." I froze, my fork hovering over my plate. The mood at the table shifted immediately. Conversations quieted, and all eyes were now on me. My dad took the opportunity to pile on, his voice louder than necessary. "Your mother's right," he said, shaking his head in mock disappointment. "We supported you when you were younger. It's only fair you give back, especially now that we're struggling." My stomach twisted as anger rose in my chest. Supported me? They'd left me to fend for myself, barely acknowledging my existence, while showering Ethan with everything he asked for. And now they had the audacity to rewrite history in front of half the family? I forced myself to take a deep breath, trying to suppress the urge to explode. "What are you talking about?" I asked, keeping my voice steady despite the boiling rage beneath the surface. "Oh, don't act like you don't know," my mom replied, her tone shifting from sweet to sharp. "Your father and I worked hard to give you a good life. We made sacrifices for you, Lily. And now, when we need a little help, you can't even be bothered to lift a finger." My dad nodded, adding, "It's not like we're asking for much. Just a little help while we get back on our feet. But apparently, family doesn't matter to you anymore." The murmurs around the table grew louder. I could see Aunt Carol frowning, Uncle Jim leaning forward, as if to catch every word. Some cousins exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable, while others whispered behind their hands. My parents were putting on a show, framing me as the ungrateful daughter who'd abandoned her struggling family. I felt my face grow hot, the weight of everyone's judgment pressing down on me. But instead of backing down, I squared my shoulders and looked my parents in the eye. "Do you really want to have this conversation here?" I asked, my voice calm but icy. My mom blinked, momentarily thrown off, but my dad recovered quickly. "Why not?" he said, gesturing to the room. "Everyone here knows how important family is. Maybe they'll help you understand your responsibilities." Responsibilities. The word echoed in my mind, igniting a fire in my chest. If they wanted a public spectacle, they were about to get one. "Fine," I said, setting down my fork and folding my hands on the table. "Let's talk about responsibilities. But don't expect me to stay quiet while you rewrite history." The room grew even quieter, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. If my parents thought they could guilt me into submission, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. For a brief moment, I considered letting the confrontation slide. It would have been easier to keep the peace, to let my parents control the narrative while I smiled politely and swallowed the humiliation. But then I thought about the years I'd spent clawing my way through college, working 2 jobs while Ethan coasted through life on my parents' dime. I thought about all the times they'd brushed me off, laughed at my struggles, and ignored my needs. And now, here they were, spinning lies in front of everyone to paint me as the ungrateful villain. I couldn't let them get away with it. "You want to talk about support?" I said, my voice steady, but sharp enough to cut through the murmurs. My parents' smug expressions faltered as I continued. "Let's get the facts straight. You laughed at me when I asked for help with college. You told me I was on my own. So I worked for everything I have, every cent, every opportunity, every bit of success." I glanced around the table, making sure my audience was paying attention. Meanwhile, Ethan got his tuition paid for, a car, and endless handouts. Don't stand here and pretend you supported me when the truth is you left me to fend for myself. The room fell silent. My parents looked stunned, like they hadn't expected me to fight back. My mom's face went pale, and my dad's jaw tightened, but neither of them said a word. I took their silence as permission to keep going. "And let's not forget," I added, my voice rising slightly, "how you borrowed money from Aunt Carol, Uncle Jim, and who knows who else, promising it was for both of our educations. Funny how Ethan's the only one who benefited from that money, isn't it? Did you ever repay them? Or did you just assume they'd forget?" My words hit like a thunderclap. Aunt Carol gasped audibly, her face a mix of shock and fury. "Wait a minute," she said, her voice trembling. "You told me that money was for Lily's tuition. I assumed Ethan had a scholarship." Uncle Jim's brows furrowed as he leaned forward in his chair. "You said the same thing to me," he muttered, his voice thick with anger. "You said it was for both kids." My dad recovered first, his face flushing red as he tried to regain control. "That's not how it happened," he snapped, his voice rising. "You don't understand the whole story." "Oh, I understand perfectly," I interrupted, refusing to let him twist the narrative. You used me as an excuse to borrow money, then funneled it all to Ethan. You left me to struggle, and now you're here demanding I help you? How dare you? My mom tried to jump in, her voice shaking. We were just trying to do the best we could. Things were hard back then. Hard for who? I shot back, my anger bubbling to the surface. Not for Ethan. He got everything he wanted while I was working double shifts to keep a roof over my head. You had plenty of money when it came to him. But when it came to me, suddenly you were broke? The murmurs around the table grew louder as my relatives processed what I was saying. I could see the wheels turning in their heads, the pieces clicking into place. My parents had spent years crafting an image of themselves as doting, supportive parents. But now, that illusion was crumbling in real time, and there was no way for them to stop it. You know what's really funny? I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. You're standing here, demanding I bail you out, when I'm the only one in this family who's ever had to take care of myself. Maybe if you'd been half as responsible as you expected me to be, you wouldn't be in this mess. The silence that followed was deafening. My parents looked furious, but for once, they didn't have a comeback. And for the first time in years, I felt like I'd finally taken back the power they'd tried so hard to strip from me. The murmurs began the moment I stopped speaking. I could see Aunt Carol whispering furiously to Uncle Jim, her face flushed with a mix of shock and fury. Other relatives exchanged wide-eyed glances, leaning toward one another as if to confirm they'd heard me correctly. My parents stood frozen, their mouths opening and closing like fish gasping for air. Whatever control they thought they had over the narrative had slipped through their fingers. Lily, this isn't the time or place, my dad finally said, his voice gruff and strained. His face was beet red, a combination of anger and embarrassment. We shouldn't be airing private family matters here. I folded my arms, meeting his glare without flinching. You're right, I said coolly. It's not the time or place. But you're the ones who brought this up. Don't act like victims now. If you wanted to keep your lies under wraps, maybe don't air them at a wedding. My mom stepped in, her voice trembling with poorly disguised indignation. We weren't trying to cause a scene. We were just having a discussion. You didn't have to escalate it like that. I laughed bitterly. A discussion? Publicly accusing me of being selfish is your idea of a discussion? Please. You knew exactly what you were doing. Her face twisted, and she opened her mouth to respond, but Aunt Carol beat her to it. Hold on, she snapped, her sharp voice cutting through the murmurs. Is what Lily said true? Did you really use my money for Ethan after you told me it was for her tuition? My dad stammered, searching for a response. That's not entirely accurate, he said, his voice faltering. Things were complicated. Complicated? Uncle Jim cut in, his tone cold. You said the same thing to me. Promised it was for both kids. We gave you that money because we thought we were helping Lily. If we'd known it was all going to Ethan, he trailed off, shaking his head in disbelief. The atmosphere around the table had shifted entirely. Moments ago, my parents had been basking in the admiration of relatives they'd spent years manipulating. Now, those same relatives looked at them with narrowed eyes and pursed lips, their trust visibly crumbling. My dad's voice grew louder as he tried to salvage the situation. Look, we did the best we could with what we had. Raising 2 kids isn't easy, and sometimes sacrifices had to be made. Sacrifices for who? I asked, refusing to let him regain the upper hand. Because Ethan certainly didn't make any. You sacrificed my future, so he could live comfortably. And now you're asking me to clean up the mess you made? No. Absolutely not. The silence that followed was deafening. My mom looked like she was on the verge of tears, but I didn't feel a shred of sympathy. For years, they'd painted themselves as generous, selfless parents while using me as their scapegoat. Now, they were finally being exposed for who they really were. I turned to leave, my heart pounding with adrenaline. I'm done here, I said over my shoulder. If you want to keep lying to yourselves, go ahead. But don't expect me to play along. As I walked away, I could hear my parents sputtering behind me, their voices drowned out by the low hum of relatives murmuring among themselves. I didn't look back. Let them deal with the fallout. They'd brought it on themselves. The fallout hit like a tidal wave. Within days of Mia's wedding, I started getting calls and texts from relatives. At first, they were confused, wanting to confirm what they'd heard. Is it true? Aunt Carol asked, her voice a mix of disbelief and anger. Did your parents really use the money I lent them for Ethan, not you? Yes, it's true, I said bluntly. They never gave me a cent for college. I worked multiple jobs to pay for everything myself. There was a pause on the other end of the line before Aunt Carol sighed heavily. They told me they needed it for both of you. I thought they were just trying to give you kids a better future. I had no idea they were lying. Her voice trembled with regret, and I could picture her shaking her head in frustration. Uncle Jim called the next day, echoing Aunt Carol's story. We just thought they'd fallen on hard times, he said. We figured, family helps family. But to find out they funneled all of it to Ethan while you were left to fend for yourself. I'm sorry, Lily. I didn't know. It wasn't long before those conversations turned into action. Aunt Carol and Uncle Jim, furious and feeling betrayed, decided to take legal action against my parents for the unpaid loans. At first, I couldn't believe it. They'd always been the type to let things slide for the sake of keeping the peace. But this was different. It's not just the money, Aunt Carol said during one call. It's the principle. They lied to us, Lily. They used you as a pawn. They can't keep getting away with this. Once the lawsuits were filed, other relatives began speaking up. Some cut ties with my parents entirely, refusing to associate with people who had exploited family for their own gain. My parents' carefully constructed web of lies was unraveling, and the truth was finally catching up to them. Through it all, I stayed on the sidelines, watching the chaos unfold. I didn't feel vindicated. There was no satisfaction in seeing my parents fall apart, but I couldn't bring myself to intervene. This was their mess to clean up, not mine. Ethan, of course, wasn't taking it well. How could you do this to Mom and Dad? He texted me, his tone dripping with indignation. They're your parents. You're supposed to protect them, not tear them down. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. Protect them from what? I wrote back. The truth? They did this to themselves, Ethan. You don't get to blame me for their lies. His reply came quickly. You're selfish. They gave you everything, and now you're throwing them under the bus. I didn't bother responding after that. It was clear Ethan was just as deluded as my parents, refusing to see the role he'd played in their downfall. For years, he'd lived in a bubble of entitlement, shielded from reality by their sacrifices. Now, that bubble was bursting, and I wasn't about to cushion the blow. As the lawsuits progressed and my parents scrambled to defend themselves, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in years, I wasn't the one carrying the weight of their mistakes. The truth was out, and it was their turn to deal with the consequences. Ethan's perfect little bubble popped faster than I expected. With Aunt Carol and Uncle Jim's lawsuits in full swing and no other relatives willing to step in, my parents' finances were completely decimated. Suddenly, they couldn't afford to keep subsidizing Ethan's carefree lifestyle. The car payment stopped, his credit cards were maxed out, and the endless flow of fun money dried up. For the first time in his life, my golden child brother had to confront reality. My parents insisted he get a job, an idea that seemed to horrify him. A job, he reportedly whined, as though the word itself was beneath him. Doing what? It was almost comical, watching someone who had coasted through life on handouts come to terms with the fact that he was no longer special. Eventually, Ethan landed a job at a local retail store, working the cash register. It wasn't glamorous, but it was all he could get without a shred of work experience to his name. According to mutual acquaintances, he spent most of his shifts complaining about how unfair life was, but at least he was finally earning his own money, however reluctantly. For Ethan, the reality of working a low-wage job hit hard. He'd never had to manage his own finances before, and it quickly became clear he had no idea how to budget. He blew his first paycheck on fast food, video games, and a new pair of sneakers, only to realize he had no money left for gas or his phone bill. When he turned to my parents for help, they had nothing to give him. Every spare dollar they had was being swallowed up by legal fees and court-ordered repayments. I heard through the grapevine that Ethan had a meltdown at work one day, yelling at his manager for scheduling him on a weekend. I'm not some lowlife who works weekends, he reportedly shouted, as though that argument would earn him special treatment. Instead, he got a stern warning and a docked paycheck for storming out mid-shift. It was hard not to feel a twisted sense of satisfaction as I watched Ethan flounder. For years, I had carried the weight of responsibility while he basked in the privilege of being the favorite. Now, he was finally getting a taste of what it meant to fend for himself. Still, there were moments when I felt a pang of pity for him. Ethan had never been taught how to handle adversity or take responsibility for his own life. My parents had shielded him from every consequence, leaving him completely unprepared for the real world. Now, as their resources dried up and the legal battles escalated, he was left stranded, with no one to save him. I thought about reaching out, but the bitterness lingered. Why should I step in when he had shown me nothing but disdain? When he had been complicit in the very favoritism that had left me scrambling for survival. The irony of it all wasn't lost on me. Ethan was finally being forced to grow up, albeit under duress, while I stood on the sidelines, watching the fallout. It wasn't the justice I'd imagined, but it was justice nonetheless. For the first time in years, I felt the scales of our family dynamic beginning to balance, though the cost of that balance was higher than I'd ever expected. As the lawsuits progressed, and the walls began closing in on my parents, their desperation became almost palpable. They had lost the goodwill of most of the family, their finances were in shambles, and Ethan's retail job barely covered his expenses, let alone theirs. With nowhere else to turn, they decided to focus their energy on me, their estranged, selfish daughter who apparently held the key to fixing their problems. It started with pleading phone calls from my mom. "Lily," she began one afternoon, her voice trembling with feigned sincerity. "I know things haven't been perfect between us, but we really need your help. If you could just talk to Carol and Jim, maybe explain that there was a misunderstanding. You know how family can blow things out of proportion." "There wasn't a misunderstanding," I replied coldly. "You lied to them, and I'm not going to cover for you." My mom sighed dramatically, her tone shifting to one of wounded innocence. "I don't know why you're being so stubborn. They're family, Lily. They'll listen to you. You could make this all go away if you just explain things." "That's not my responsibility," I said firmly. "You made this mess. You can clean it up." The pleading quickly gave way to anger. My dad called me the next day, his voice already sharp with irritation. "You need to step up, Lily," he snapped. "We're your parents. After everything we've done for you, you'd really stand by while your family suffers?" I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "Everything you've done for me?" I shot back. "You mean like laughing in my face when I asked for help with college? Or funneling money meant for me to Ethan instead? You abandoned me when I needed you most, and now you're asking me to save you? I think I'll pass." "You're being unreasonable," he growled. "This isn't just about us. It's about family. Do you really want to be the reason this family falls apart?" "No, Dad," I said, my voice steady. "The family fell apart because of your lies, your favoritism, and your refusal to take responsibility. Don't put that on me." Their attempts didn't stop there. My mom left voicemails that alternated between tearful pleas and passive-aggressive jabs. "I just don't understand how you can be so cold, Lily," one message said. "We're your parents. We raised you. Don't you think you owe us something?" Ethan joined in too, texting me multiple times a day. "Do you really hate us that much?" one message read. "Mom and Dad are drowning, and you're just standing there watching. I don't even recognize you anymore." I ignored most of their messages, deleting them without reading more than the first line. But one day, Ethan caught me at a weak moment, and I replied, "What exactly do you expect me to do?" I typed, "Lie for them? Pretend they didn't spend years prioritizing you at my expense? Maybe instead of blaming me, you should look in the mirror." His response was as predictable as it was infuriating. "This isn't about the past, Lily. It's about now. They need help. We all need help. You're just being spiteful." I didn't bother replying. There was no point. My parents and Ethan weren't interested in accountability. They just wanted me to play the role of the dutiful daughter, erasing the consequences of their actions with a single conversation. But I'd spent my entire life cleaning up after their messes, and I wasn't going to do it again. Let them call me selfish. Let them label me the villain. I wasn't going to sacrifice my peace of mind to protect their lies. They had built this house of cards, and it wasn't my job to stop it from collapsing. The legal battles quickly turned into a spectacle, one that I watched unfold from a safe distance. Aunt Carol and Uncle Jim weren't just angry. They were determined to see justice served. They'd been more than generous over the years, trusting my parents to honor their promises, and now they were done playing nice. My parents, of course, fought back with every excuse they could muster. They claimed financial hardship, saying they were barely scraping by and couldn't afford to repay the loans. When that didn't work, they tried to argue that there had been a miscommunication, insisting they never intended to use the money solely for my education. At one point, my dad even fabricated a story about a verbal forgiveness agreement, claiming Aunt Carol had told him the debt was forgiven as a gesture of goodwill. None of it held up in court. Aunt Carol and Uncle Jim had documentation, texts, emails, even handwritten notes that laid out the terms of the loans in black and white. Every lie my parents told was dismantled piece by piece until they had nothing left to stand on. When the rulings finally came down, the court ordered my parents to repay every cent they'd borrowed, plus interest. It was a crushing blow, one they couldn't afford to absorb. Their faces in the courtroom said it all, a mixture of disbelief, humiliation, and simmering rage. Watching the truth catch up to them was both satisfying and bittersweet. On one hand, it felt like long overdue justice. For years, they'd used lies and manipulation to get what they wanted, never facing any real consequences. Now, the web they'd spun had unraveled, and there was no escaping the fallout. But on the other hand, this wasn't the ending I'd wanted. I hadn't set out to destroy my parents' lives. I'd only wanted them to stop blaming me for their mistakes. Yet here they were, facing financial ruin, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of regret. Not for their choices, but for the family we could have been if things had been different. Ethan, meanwhile, was spiraling. Without my parents' financial support, he was barely scraping by. His job at the retail store wasn't enough to cover his bills, let alone the lifestyle he was used to. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd moved back in with my parents, a situation that only added to their already unbearable stress. Their once perfect golden child was now a bitter shadow of himself. According to one relative, Ethan had taken to blaming everyone but himself for his predicament, his boss, the economy, and of course me. She could fix this if she wanted to, he reportedly ranted one night. She's just too selfish to care. My parents didn't help matters. In their eyes, I was the reason they were drowning in debt, the reason Ethan was floundering. But deep down, I think even they knew the truth. This was their own doing. They had created this dynamic, built a house of cards on lies and favoritism, and now they were reaping the consequences. As much as they wanted to pin their downfall on me, I refused to take on that guilt. I hadn't lied, manipulated, or squandered resources. I had simply stood my ground. And if that was enough to shatter their carefully constructed facade, then maybe it wasn't as strong as they thought it was. And the aftermath of the lawsuits, the family fractured like a fragile mirror dropped from a height. On one side were the relatives who supported me, praising my courage for standing up to my parents and exposing the truth. Aunt Carol and Uncle Jim, still simmering with anger, became my unexpected allies. "You did the right thing, Lily," Aunt Carol said during one of our conversations. "If you hadn't spoken up, they would have kept taking advantage of people. You stopped them." But on the other side were the relatives who saw me as the villain. "You didn't have to make it public," one cousin said at a family gathering I almost didn't attend. "Family sticks together, even when things aren't perfect. What you did, well, it feels like betrayal." Others whispered that I was selfish, that I should have just helped my parents instead of tearing the family apart. Their judgment stung more than I wanted to admit. I knew I hadn't created the mess. My parents had done that all on their own, but being painted as the troublemaker made the isolation hard to ignore. Ryan, my fiancé, was my anchor through it all. Whenever the guilt started to creep in, he reminded me why I'd taken a stand in the first place. "You didn't create this mess," he told me one night as we sat on the couch, his arm wrapped protectively around my shoulders. "You just refused to let them keep pretending it didn't exist. That's not betrayal, it's accountability." His unwavering support was my lifeline, but it didn't erase the ache in my chest. Despite everything, they were still my family. I didn't miss the manipulation, the lies, or the favoritism, but I missed the idea of what family could have been. The warmth, the unconditional love, the sense of belonging. I wondered if I'd ever truly had that, or if it had always been an illusion. The loneliness crept in during quiet moments when the noise of the fallout faded, and I was left alone with my thoughts. I thought about holidays growing up, the laughter that seemed real at the time, but now felt hollow in hindsight. I thought about Ethan, wondering if he was angry because he genuinely felt betrayed or because he'd never learned to face consequences. Part of me wondered if things could ever be repaired. If my parents could ever acknowledge their mistakes, if Ethan could take responsibility for his own life. But another part of me knew that even if those things happened, the damage would still remain. Trust doesn't rebuild overnight if it rebuilds at all. For now, I focused on the family I was building with Ryan. He reminded me of what love should feel like, honest, supportive, and free from conditions. And while I didn't know what the future held, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't willing to compromise my peace to fit into a version of family that had never truly existed. The legal battles are finally over. My parents lost every appeal, and the courts ruled against them on every claim. They've been ordered to repay Aunt Carol, Uncle Jim, and several others who stepped forward after the truth came out. Ethan has stopped reaching out entirely, his anger simmering quietly on the sidelines. And yet, as I sit here in my apartment, staring out the window at the city lights, I can't help but feel conflicted. Part of me feels relief. Justice was served, and my parents are finally facing the consequences of their actions. The lies they told for years have been exposed, and they can no longer hide behind the facade of perfect parents. Ethan, too, has been forced to confront the reality of adulthood, something I never thought I'd live to see. But another part of me feels the weight of what's been lost. As flawed as they were still my family. I grew up believing that no matter what, family sticks together. That no matter how bad things got, there was always a way to come back from it. Now, I'm not so sure. I wonder if there's any way forward, any chance for reconciliation. Ryan, ever supportive, tells me I don't owe them anything. You've done enough, he says whenever the guilt creeps in. And he's right, I know he's right. But the ache doesn't listen to reason. I didn't choose this outcome. I only refuse to play along with their lies. Yet here I am, estranged from the people who were supposed to be my closest allies, the people I once looked to for guidance and love. Would I even want reconciliation if it were possible? That's the question I keep turning over in my mind. For years, I twisted myself into shapes to fit into a version of family that was never real. I compromised my dignity, swallowed my pride, and accepted less than I deserved, all in the name of keeping the peace. If reconciliation means going back to that, I don't think I want it. Still, I miss the idea of family. The version I created in my head as a kid. The warm dinners, the laughter, the unconditional support. I wonder if I'll ever truly stop grieving for what never was. For now, I'm focusing on myself. On the life I've built without their help. It's not perfect, and it's lonelier than I'd like, but it's mine. Ryan and I are planning our future together, building a foundation that feels honest and whole. It's a far cry from the fractured relationships I left behind, and for that, I'm grateful. The road ahead is uncertain, and I don't know if my parents or Ethan will ever come to terms with the choices they made. I don't know if they'll ever truly see me for who I am instead of who they wanted me to be. What I do know is this: I won't compromise my dignity to fit into a family that never valued me. If they want a relationship, the ball is in their court. Whether they ever take that step is up to them. But me? I'm moving forward, and that's enough for now.